Welcome to Simplified UPSC by PPP, where we listen, learn, and grow together. Detailed lecture notes in English and Hindi, plus practice questions for prelims and mains, only on our Telegram channel. Link in description. Like and subscribe for more.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into it, tackling, well, one of the heaviest topics in global governance. International environmental conventions.
Absolutely. It's a dense field.
Yeah, if you're gearing up for a challenge like understanding India's global environmental commitments, this deep dive should hopefully make things a bit clearer. It's your essential guide.
Exactly right. The source material we're working from, Chapter 19, it's just packed with agreements, dates, protocols, mechanisms. It can feel overwhelming.
Information overload is putting it mildly.
Right. So our mission today is pretty focused. Extract the core details of the year, the main objective, the key provisions for every major agreement mentioned in the source, and crucially, understand the hierarchy.
You mean like the difference between a convention and a protocol?
Precisely. That distinction is vital for grasping how these agreements actually work, how they're enforced, and what India's obligations really are.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Where should we start? The beginning seems logical.
Let's anchor this in 1992. The UN Conference on Environment and Development, UNCCD.
The Rio Summit. Everyone's heard of that one. Rio de Janeiro. That really felt like the moment things shifted, didn't it? From just thinking about conservation to, well, sustainable development.
It fundamentally changed the conversation. And Rio wasn't just talk, It dug deep into problematic production patterns.
Like what specifically?
Well, the source mentions things like toxic components let in gasoline, for example, poisonous waste disposal, radioactive stuff, too. Rio pushed for a systematic look at these issues.
And it spurred the search for alternatives. Cleaner energy.
That was a huge part of the mandate coming out of Rio, finding cleaner ways to power development.
And of course, the big outcome everyone remembers. The Rio Conventions. The big three.
Yes, the pillars that everything else sort of builds on. UNFCCC for climate change, UNCCD for desertification, and CBD for biodiversity. We need to tackle each one. Let's start with biodiversity, the CBD.
All right, the Convention on Biological Diversity. CBD, adopted right there in Rio, 1992. This one feels broader than just saving endangered species, right? It's about managing all living resources globally.
It is. The CBD operates on three main goals, a kind of triple mandate. And these are absolutely critical for you to remember. They define the whole convention.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First, straightforward enough, the conservation of biological diversity, protecting species and ecosystems.
Got it.
Second is the sustainable use of its components, recognizing, that humans use resources, but insisting it has to be done in a way that lasts long term.
Makes sense. And the third one, you mentioned this can be tricky.
Yes, the third objective, the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits that arise from using genetic resources. This was pretty revolutionary at the time.
Why revolutionary?
Well, it acknowledged a basic reality. A lot of the world's biodiversity is in developing countries, but often the research, the commercialization, what they call bioprospecting, happens in developed nations.
So the benefits weren't flowing back.
Exactly. So the CBD aimed to fix that imbalance. And for India, as a signatory, this meant bringing these principles into domestic law.
Right. Tell us about how India aligned with this. What did we do internally?
India passed the Biological Diversity Act in 2002. Its purpose mirrors the CBD's goals: conservation, sustainable use, and that crucial fair and equitable benefit sharing.
And how is that actually managed on the ground?
The Act set up a three-tier structure. You've got the National Biodiversity Authority, the NBA, at the top, then state biodiversity boards, SBBs, and right down at the local level, biodiversity management committees, or BMCs.
So a hierarchy from national policy down to local communities.
Precisely. Designed to manage resources and benefit sharing across all those levels.
Okay, broad goals are one thing, but how do you measure progress? That's where the Aichi targets came in, right?
Yes, the Aichi biodiversity targets. These were meant to provide specific, measurable milestones for CBD signatories. Mostly aiming for 2020, though. Quite ambitious deadlines.
What kind of targets are we talking about? Give us some examples from the source.
Okay, target 2, for instance. This said biodiversity values had to be integrated into national and local development plans, poverty reduction strategies, even national accounting systems, all by 2020.
Wow, embedding it right into economic planning.
Exactly. And Target 3 tackled harmful incentives. It required countries to reform or phase out subsidies and other things that damage biodiversity, again, by 2020.
And Target 4, that sounds like it involved businesses too.
It did. Target 4 aimed for governments, businesses, stakeholders, everyone to have plans for sustainable production and consumption, keeping resource use within safe ecological limits, also by 2020.
So these targets were really trying to make sustainability operational across the board, government, economy, business.
Okay, so the CBD sets the stage, but the real how-to often comes in the protocols, right? These supplementary agreements that detail implementation.
Exactly. Protocols add the teeth, the specific rules.
Let's start with one that causes quite a bit of public concern. Living modified organisms, LMOs.
Right. That brings us straight to the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. Its whole focus is LMOs, organisms resulting from modern biotechnology. The objective: to protect biodiversity from potential risks these LMOs might pose, particularly when they cross borders. And it has a specific mechanism for managing this risk, doesn't it? The AIA procedure.
Yes, the Advanced Informed Agreement procedure, AIA. This is a really important mechanism to understand, quite detailed.
Okay, walk us through it. How does it handle exporting LMOs?
So the AIA procedure acts as a safeguard. If a country wants to export an LMO that's intended for, say, release into the environment of another country, they must notify the importing country in writing before that first shipment happens.
A heads up.
Give a formal heads up. Then the clock starts ticking. The importing party has 90 days just to acknowledge they received the notification.
Okay.
And then they have a maximum of 270 days. So quite a while to communicate their final decision, yes or no, to the import.
And what's the basis for that yes-no decision? Can they just say no?
Critically, no. The sources are clear. The decision must be based on a risk assessment, a scientifically sound and transparent one. It's about evaluating the potential impact of that LMO on the importing country's environment and biodiversity.
So science-based decisions, not just politics. What if something goes wrong? If an LMO does cause damage, despite the assessment?
That's where another agreement comes in, kind of reinforcing Cartagena. It's the Nagoya Kuala Lumpur Supplementary Protocol on Liability and Redress.
Liability and redress sounds like it deals with consequences.
Exactly. It lays out the response measures required if damage to biodiversity does occur because of LMOs. The basic principle is that the operator, the entity controlling the LMO, is responsible for taking action.
And if they don't?
Then the competent authority, the government agency basically, can step in, carry out the response measures itself, and then recover the costs from that operator. So it builds in accountability.
Okay, that covers the biosafety side. Now let's swing back to that third CBD objective, benefit sharing. There's a specific protocol for that too, right?
Yes, absolutely central to making that objective work in practice. It's the Nagoya Protocol on ABS.
ABS.
Access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. The full title really spells out its purpose.
So it provides the legal framework for that sharing. Why was a whole separate protocol needed if the CBD already mentioned it?
It was needed for legal certainty and transparency. Think about it. Before Nagoya, a company might take a plant from a community, develop a drug, make millions, and the original providers of that genetic resource might get nothing. There was no clear, predictable framework.
So Nagoya creates rules for access.
Yes, predictable conditions for accessing genetic resources. And, just as importantly, it ensures that benefits which can be monetary, like royalties, or non-monetary, like sharing research results, flow back to the party providing the resources, often the country or community where they originated.
And that creates an incentive.
A direct economic incentive. If communities or countries know they'll benefit from conserving their biodiversity, they're more likely to protect it. It connects conservation directly to development and well-being. Makes it less abstract.
Right, we covered CBD in detail, but you mentioned 3 Rio pillars. We absolutely have to talk about climate change. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. Probably the most high-profile and definitely the most politically charged of the 3.
Without a doubt. Adopted in 1992 alongside the others, its main goal was and is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that prevents dangerous human interference with the climate system.
But the UNFCCC itself, it's a framework, right? It doesn't actually set emission limits for countries.
That's a crucial distinction. The Framework Convention itself doesn't impose legally binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions for individual countries, nor does it have, strong enforcement mechanisms built in.
So what does it do?
It establishes the process. It set up the annual big meeting, the Conference of the Parties, or COP, which is the main decision-making body. And critically, it laid down foundational principles, the big one being common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR.
Ah, yes, CBDR. That term comes up constantly in climate talks. Break that down for us. What does it mean in practice?
It's an acknowledgement of two things. One, climate change is a shared global problem. Everyone has a responsibility. But, and this is the differentiated part, developed countries bear a greater historical responsibility because they've been emitting for much longer.
So they need to do more.
They need to take the lead in cutting their own emissions, and they need to help developing countries both cut emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change that are already happening. That principle shapes pretty much all subsequent climate negotiations.
Okay, so the UNFCCC sets the stage. The first real attempt to put binding numbers on emissions came later, with the Kyoto Protocol, adopted in 1997.
Exactly. Kyoto was the first major attempt to operationalize CBDR with hard targets. It set mandatory emission reduction targets, but primarily for developed countries, the ones listed in Annex I of the protocol.
For specific time periods, right?
Yes. There was a first commitment period from 2008 to 2012, and then a second one was agreed later. But the key innovation in Kyoto, besides the targets, was the introduction of flexibility mechanisms, market-based tools.
To help countries meet their targets more cheaply.
That was the idea. 3 main mechanisms. You need to know these.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, emissions trading. Basically, countries that beat their targets could sell their excess emission units to countries struggling to meet theirs. A carbon market among developed nations.
Second,
Joint implementation, or JI. This allowed a developed country, Annex I, to invest in an emission reduction project in another developed country, also Annex I, and earn credits for it.
okay, both of those are among developed countries. What about involving developing nations?
That's the third one, and it's hugely significant, especially for countries like India. The Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM.
How did the CDM work?
The CDM allowed a developed country, Annex I, to fund an emission reduction project. Think renewable energy efficiency in a developing country, non-Annex I. The developed country then earned certified emission reductions, or CERs, from that project.
And they could use those CERs.
To count towards meeting their own Kyoto targets. It was meant to lower the cost of compliance for developed countries and drive clean investment into developing ones.
A win-win, in theory.
In theory. And importantly, the source material points out something called the Adaptation Fund. This fund helps vulnerable developing countries adapt to climate impacts. And how is it financed? Partly.
Let me guess, linked to the CDM.
Exactly. A 2% levy, a share of the proceeds on the CERs issued for CDM projects goes into the Adaptation Fund. So there's a direct link between mitigation activities and funding for adaptation.
Interesting mechanism. Okay, Kyoto had its issues, didn't really include major emitters like the U.S. long-term or developing countries with targets. So we moved on to the Paris Agreement in 2015. How did Paris change the game?
Paris represented a major shift in approach. Kyoto is generally top-down targets negotiated internationally and assigned. Paris is more bottom-up.
Meaning countries set their own targets.
Essentially, yes. It's still a legally binding international treaty, but it relies on nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. Each country submits its own plan for cutting emissions and adapting to climate change.
Are these NDCs one-offs?
No, that's key. Countries have to submit new, more ambitious NDCs every 5 years. It's designed as a ratchet mechanism to increase ambition over time. The overall goal is keeping global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees.
So it moved away from the strict Annex I, non-Annex I division of Kyoto.
Yes, it applies to all parties, reflecting the reality that major developing countries are now significant emitters too, while still upholding the principle of CBDR in terms of support and ambition levels.
This whole evolution UNFCCC framework, Kyoto's binding targets, Paris's NDCs, it really highlights just how difficult it is to get global agreement on climate action when national economies are involved.
It absolutely does. It's a constant balancing act between environmental necessity, economic reality, equity, and frankly, political will. The mechanisms like the CDM and the Adaptation Fund are complex attempts to make the system work, especially for developing nations needing support. #Tag33. Agreements focused on habitat and species.
Okay, let's shift our focus now. We've covered the big framework conventions from Rio. Now let's dive into agreements that target specific habitats and species protection. And we should start with the oldest one here, focused entirely on watery ecosystems.
Right, that would be the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. It's actually quite old, adopted way back in 1971 in Ramsar, Iran.
And India is involved.
Yes, India became a contracting party in 1981, relatively early on.
What's the main goal of Ramsar? Just protecting wetlands.
It's about conservation and wise use. That's a key phrase for Ramsar. And the definition of wetland under the convention is incredibly broad.
How broad?
It covers everything from marshes, fens, peatlands, to rivers, lakes, coastal areas. Even includes artificial wetlands like reservoirs and rice paddies. And marine waters up to 6 meters deep at low tide. Basically anywhere water is the dominant factor.
So wise use implies they aren't just meant to be fenced-off reserves.
Exactly. It recognizes that wetlands provide crucial ecosystem services and that humans interact with them. Wise use means maintaining their ecological character while allowing for sustainable human use.
How does India track its commitment? You mentioned we joined in '81.
India designates specific sites as wetlands of international importance. These go on the official Ramsar list. Currently, the source mentions India has 26 such sites.
And having a site on the list means?
It signifies a government commitment to maintain its ecological character and manage it effectively. Domestically, policies like the National Conservation Strategy in 1992 and the National Water Policy 2002 also emphasize wetland conservation, aligning with Ramsar's goals.
What if one of these important wetlands gets into trouble? Is there a mechanism?
Yes, there's something called the Montreal Record. This is essentially a list, maintained as part of the Ramsar list, for sites that are facing significant ecological threats.
Like pollution or development pressure?
Exactly. Due to technological developments, pollution, or other human interference. Getting listed on the Montreal Record flags the site as a priority for conservation action, often bringing national and international attention and resources to help address the problem.
Okay, from wetlands to wildlife trade. This next one is probably quite well known. CITES.
Yes, cites the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It entered into force in 1975. Its objective is very specific and very important.
Which is?
To ensure that international trade buying and selling across borders of wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival in the wild. It's purely focused on the trade aspect.
Right, and CITES is known for its appendices.
Right.
This is where the different levels of regulation come in, isn't it? This seems crucial for prelims.
Absolutely critical. There are 3 appendices. You need to know what each one means.
Okay, let's break them down. Appendix 1.
Appendix I lists species that are most endangered. They are threatened with extinction and are, or might be, affected by trade. For these species, commercial trade is essentially banned.
Banned. No exceptions.
Only in very exceptional circumstances, like for scientific research, and requires permits from both exporting and importing countries. But general commercial trade, no. Think tigers, gorillas, certain orchids.
Got it. Highest protection. What about Appendix 2?
Appendix 2 is, you could say, the preventative list. It includes species that aren't necessarily threatened with extinction right now, but they could become threatened if trade isn't strictly controlled.
So trade is allowed but regulated.
Exactly. Trade is allowed but requires an export permit from the country of origin, proving the specimen was legally obtained and that the trade won't be detrimental to the survival of the species. Most CITES-listed species fall into Appendix 2.
Okay, and the third one? Appendix 3.
Appendix 3 is a bit different. It lists species that are protected in at least one country, and that country has asked other CITES parties for help in controlling the trade.
So it's more about national protection needing international cooperation.
Precisely. The source gives examples like map turtles, walruses, Cape stag beetles. Trade in Appendix 3 species typically requires export permits or certificates of origin. It helps countries monitor trade in species they are concerned about domestically.
And how is CITES managed globally? Through those COP meetings again?
Yes, the Conference of the Parties, the COP, is the governing body. It meets periodically to review implementation, amend the appendices, adding or removing species, or moving them between appendices. An interesting detail from the source, meetings used to be every 2 years, but since COP13, they are held every 3 years.
Good detail. Is there another key species convention we should cover here?
Yes, one more focused specifically on movement. The Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, usually called CMS, or the Bonn Convention.
Bonn Convention? Okay. Yeah. Adopted when?
1979. As the name suggests, its goal is the conservation of migratory species, terrestrial, marine, and birds, across their entire migratory range. Because these animals cross borders, International cooperation is essential.
And India is involved here too.
Yes, India is a signatory to CMS as well. It reflects the fact that we host many important migratory species like Siberian cranes or Amur falcons and have a responsibility to protect them along their flyways. #5, FA, atmosphere, and ozone depletion.
All right, let's change altitude completely now and talk about the atmosphere. Specifically, one of the, well, arguably biggest success stories in international environmental law, protecting the ozone layer.
It really is often cited as a major success. But first, we need to understand the problem they were trying to solve, the science bit.
Okay, let's get into chemistry.
Ozone.
There's good and bad ozone, right?
Exactly. The source makes that clear distinction. Ozone down here, in the troposphere where we live, that's bad ozone. It's a component of smog, harmful to breathe.
But the ozone layer is way up high.
Yes, in the stratosphere. That's the good ozone. It forms a protective shield, absorbing most of the sun's harmful ultraviolet B, or UVB, radiation. It's like Earth's natural sunscreen.
And without that shield,
Life as we know it probably couldn't exist. Increased UVB reaching the surface causes serious problems. Higher rates of skin cancer and cataracts in humans, damage to crops, harm to marine ecosystems. It's fundamental protection.
so what was damaging this crucial layer?
Certain man-made chemicals, primarily containing chlorine and bromine, things like chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs used in refrigeration and aerosols, and halons used in fire extinguishers.
How do they actually destroy ozone?
It's a catalytic cycle. These stable chemicals rise up to the stratosphere. UV radiation breaks them down, releasing highly reactive chlorine, Cl, or bromine Br atoms.
And these atoms attack ozone?
Yes. One chlorine atom, for example, can react with an ozone molecule, O3, breaking it apart to form chlorine monoxide, ClO, and a regular oxygen molecule, O2. But the ClO can then react further, releasing the chlorine atom again.
To destroy another ozone molecule.
Exactly. A single chlorine or bromine atom can destroy thousands of ozone molecules before it's eventually removed from the stratosphere. It's a chain reaction.
And this process is worse in certain places, right? Like over Antarctica.
Yeah.
The ozone hole.
Yes, the conditions over the poles, especially Antarctica in spring, dramatically accelerate this destruction. The key factor there is polar stratospheric clouds, or PSCs.
Ice clouds in the stratosphere.
Essentially, these clouds form in the extreme cold and provide surfaces where chlorine compounds, normally locked up in less reactive forms like hydrochloric acid, HCl, and chlorine nitrate, get converted into more active forms, especially molecular chlorine, Cl2.
And then when the sun comes back.
When sunlight returns after the polar winter, it breaks apart the Cl2, releasing massive amounts of ozone-destroying chlorine atoms. This causes the rapid depletion we see as the ozone hole. The Antarctic vortex, being very stable and long-lasting, allows this process to go on for longer than in the Arctic.
Okay, so faced with this potentially catastrophic global threat, what did the international community do?
First came the framework. The Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer in 1985. Like the UNFCCC, it established cooperation and research but didn't have binding targets.
The real action came later.
2 years later, in 1987, the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer, signed on September 16th, a date now celebrated as the International Day for the Preservation of the Ozone Layer.
And its objective was clear.
Crystal clear. Phase out the production and consumption of ozone-depleting substances, ODS, according to a set timetable. Different timetables for developed and developing countries, acknowledging the CBDR principle again.
Montreal's often hailed as successful. Why did it work so well, relatively speaking?
Several factors. Clear science, a direct link between specific chemicals and a global threat. But crucially, it included practical mechanisms to help countries comply, especially developing nations.
Like financial help.
Yes, the Multilateral Fund, MLF, established specifically to provide financial and technical assistance to developing countries, called Article 5 parties under the protocol, to help them meet their phase-out obligations, paying for things like converting industries to ozone-friendly technologies.
So that support was key to getting global buy-in.
Absolutely essential. It showed that the burden wouldn't fall solely on developing nations that hadn't caused most of the problem.
What were the potential ecological consequences if Montreal hadn't happened or failed? The source mentioned impacts beyond skin cancer.
Oh, yes. Increased UVD harms aquatic life, damaging the early stages of fish, shrimp, crabs. It can decrease their reproductive capacity. For plants, it affects photosynthesis and growth. We might have needed to breed entirely new crop varieties just to tolerate the higher UV levels.
A grim picture. Now, the protocol didn't just stop with CFCs, did it? It had to adapt.
Correct. As CFCs were phased out, industries switched to alternatives. Some of those alternatives, like hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, were safe for the ozone layer. But they turned out to be potent greenhouse gases, contributing significantly to climate change, so the protocol had to evolve again.
And that led to?
The Kigali Amendment, adopted in 2016. This amendment brought HFCs under the control of the Montreal Protocol, mandating a global phase-down of their production and consumption, using the successful framework of Montreal to tackle another environmental threat. It's a great example of an adaptive international agreement. #V, hazardous materials and land degradation. #A, hazardous materials and pollutants.
Okay, we've covered climate, biodiversity, ozone. Now let's turn to another major area of international concern. Hazardous substances, toxic waste, dangerous chemicals. There's a whole suite of conventions dealing with this, often called the chemical conventions.
That's right. These agreements generally arose from concerns about pollution crossing borders, often from richer to poorer nations, and the inherent dangers of certain persistent chemicals.
Where do we start? Maybe with the waste itself.
Let's start with the Basel Convention, adopted in 1989. Its full title is the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and Their Disposal.
Transboundary movement, so shipping waste across borders.
Exactly. That's the core focus. It was driven by public outcry in the late 80s over cases where companies in developed countries were dumping hazardous waste, often illegally, in developing countries that just didn't have the capacity to handle it safely.
So Basel aims to stop that. Toxic colonialism, sometimes called.
Precisely. It aims to minimize the generation of hazardous waste, ensure it's treated and disposed of as close to the source as possible, and strictly regulate any permitted transboundary movement to ensure environmentally sound management. It's about environmental justice.
Okay, so Basel handles the waste. What about the chemicals before they become waste? During trade?
That brings us to the Rotterdam Convention, adopted in 1998. Officially, the Rotterdam Convention on the Prior Informed Consent Procedure for certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides in international trade.
Prior informed consent, PIC. That sounds like the key mechanism here.
It absolutely is. The Rotterdam Convention facilitates information exchange about hazardous chemicals. Its core operational part is the PIC procedure.
Explain how PIC works.
Okay, so chemicals that are banned or severely restricted by countries for health or environmental reasons get listed under the convention. If an exporting country wants to ship one of these listed chemicals to another participating country, they must first obtain the explicit informed consent of the importing country.
So the importing country gets a say before the chemical arrives.
Exactly. It allows importing countries, particularly developing ones that might lack extensive regulatory systems, to decide if they actually want that hazardous chemical and if they can manage it safely. It promotes shared responsibility in the chemical trade.
Right. Basel for waste movement, Rotterdam for chemical trade consent. What's the third major chemical convention?
That's the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, or POPs, adopted in 2001.
POPs. What makes these chemicals so bad that they need their own convention?
POPs are nasty stuff. They share a set of dangerous properties. They are highly toxic. They are persistent, meaning they don't break down easily in the environment, lasting for years or decades. They are semi-volatile, so they can travel long distances on wind and water currents. They bioaccumulate.
Meaning they build up in living organisms.
Yes, they dissolve in fatty tissues and become more concentrated as they move up the food chain. And they are biologically active, interfering with bodily processes. The Stockholm Convention's goal is straightforward. Eliminate or severely restrict the production, use, trade, and release of these specific POPs.
The source material mentions the initial list as the dirty dozen. Any examples?
BDT is the classic example, famously highlighted in Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The source notes its impact on bird eggshells and hormonal disruption in animals and humans. Others included industrial chemicals like PCBs and dioxins produced as byproducts. The convention aims for global elimination where possible.
Okay, Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm. Is there one more key convention in this hazardous materials group?
Yes, one focused on a single element. The Minamata Convention on Mercury, adopted much more recently in 2013.
Named after the Minamata disaster in Japan, right?
Correct. That disaster tragically highlighted the severe health impacts of mercury poisoning. The convention aims to protect human health and the environment from anthropogenic human-caused emissions and releases of mercury and mercury compounds.
How does it do that?
It requires parties to take a range of actions. Phasing out the manufacture and trade of certain mercury-containing products like batteries, switches, certain lamps, cosmetics. Controlling mercury emissions from major industrial sources like coal-fired power plants and smelting. And also addressing issues like mercury use in small-scale gold mining and managing mercury waste and contaminated sites.
So quite comprehensive for a single substance. Now, just to recap clearly for someone trying to keep these straight, Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm. What's the absolute key difference in function between those three?
Okay, simplest terms. Basel, managing the movement and disposal of hazardous waste. Rotterdam, managing the trade of specific hazardous chemicals through prior consent, PIC. Stockholm, targeting the elimination or restriction of a specific class of chemicals, the POPs. They tackle different stages and aspects of the hazardous substance problem.
That's a helpful distinction.
Yeah.
Let's quickly connect this back to some specific pollution issues mentioned in our source material, just to ground it. Mercury, for example, beyond the convention itself.
Right. The source highlights that mercury contamination is a real issue, especially when it converts to methylmercury in water bodies and bioaccumulates in fish. High levels have been found in fish near major Indian coastal cities like Mumbai, Kolkata, Karwar.
And even in everyday items.
Yes, the controversy around compact fluorescent lamps, CFLs. They're energy efficient, which is good, but they contain a small amount of mercury, posing a disposal challenge. Shows how complex managing even small amounts of hazardous materials can be.
What about e-waste? Electronic waste is a huge problem globally and in India. What specific hazardous stuff does the source say gets released?
When e-waste isn't disposed of properly, like through burning or informal dismantling, it releases a nasty mix of heavy metals. The source lists beryllium, cadmium, chromium, mercury, and lead.
And lead is particularly bad.
Especially for children. The source notes it damages the brain and central nervous system, affects red blood cell development. These are tangible reasons why managing hazardous components and products and waste streams is so critical. #B, United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD.
Okay, that covers the chemical hazards. Let's pick up the last of the three big Rio conventions we mentioned earlier, the one focused on land.
Right, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the UNCCD, adopted in 1994.
And this one has a unique origin story related to Rio.
It does. The source points out it's the only convention that came directly from a recommendation in Agenda 21, which was one of the key outcome documents of the Rio Summit. It specifically targets desertification, land degradation, and drought, particularly focusing on arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid areas, the drylands.
Which is highly relevant for India, given our large dryland areas. Are we active in the UNCCD?
Yes. India is a signatory and significantly affected by these issues. We developed a national action program to combat desertification back in 2001.
And what kind of actions are being taken on the ground?
The source mentions several ongoing programs that contribute to the UNCCD goals. Things like the Integrated Watershed Management Program, the National Afforestation Program, planting trees, and even schemes like the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, MGNRGS, contribute by funding work that helps stabilize soil, conserve water, and reverse land degradation. #taxing tip 6. Concluding takeaways and critical analysis.
Right, we have covered a lot of ground. Climate, biodiversity, wetlands, trade, ozone, chemicals, desertification. It's a complex landscape of international agreements.
Yeah.
Let's try to boil this down into some key takeaways, especially for someone studying this.
Definitely. Let's start with some quick prelims pointers, just matching the convention to its core theme and year, based only on what our source confirms. Ready?
Go for it.
CBD, 1992. Biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, benefit sharing.
Okay.
Ramsar, India joined 1981, Convention 1971. Wetlands, remember, wise use.
Got it.
CITES, entered force 1975. Regulating international trade in endangered species, think Appendices the third.
Right.
Cartagena Protocol under CBD. Biosafety, specifically LMOs, and that AIA procedure.
Advanced Informed Agreement, yep.
Nagoya Protocol, also under CBD. Access and benefit sharing, ABS. The legal framework.
Makes sense.
Montreal Protocol, signed 1987, phasing out ozone-depleting substances, ODS, and the Kigali Amendment for HSCs.
Ozone protection.
UNFCCC, 1992. The framework for climate change, remember, CBDR.
Common but differentiated responsibilities.
Stockholm Convention, 2001. Eliminating persistent organic pollutants, POPs.
That nasty one.
And UNCCD, 1994. Combating desertification and land degradation.
Okay, that's a solid rapid recall list. Now, for the mains insights. Moving beyond just facts, what are the bigger picture challenges in making all these conventions actually work? Enforcement seems key.
Enforcement is the perennial challenge in international law, isn't it? Especially environmental law. One major structural issue, particularly for climate and anything involving resource use, comes back to CBDR.
Common but differentiated responsibilities again. Why is that such a hurdle?
Because while everyone might agree on the goal, like stabilizing the climate, agreeing on who does how much, especially when historical contributions and current development needs differ so vastly, is incredibly difficult politically and economically. It creates constant tension in negotiations.
And for developing countries, meeting the standards set by these conventions like phasing out ODS under Montreal, adopting cleaner tech under climate agreements, managing waste under Basel often requires help, right?
Absolutely critical. Real enforcement, real compliance often hinges on technology transfer and financial assistance. We talked about the multilateral fund for the Montreal Protocol.
And the adaptation fund under the UNFCCC.
Exactly. That fund, helping vulnerable countries cope with climate impacts, financed partly by a levy on CDM projects, it shows the kind of complex financial engineering needed to bridge the gap between global environmental goals and the capacities of developing nations. Without that support, commitments can remain just words on paper.
So it forces us to look at the inherent conflicts, doesn't it? The tension between these international commitments and, well, domestic economic pressures.
It does. Think about some examples touched on in the source. India is committed to biodiversity conservation under the CBD. But how does that square with, say, widespread, often unregulated sand mining in rivers?
Which the source says lowers water tables and pollutes water, damaging ecosystems.
Directly undermining wetland health and biodiversity goals. Or consider the global demand for products like palm oil, driving massive deforestation in places like Borneo and Sumatra, hotspots of biodiversity. That demand creates economic pressure that conflicts directly with the aims of CBD and potentially CITES.
So the real test is translating these international agreements into effective national and local policies that can actually steer economic activity, construction, agriculture, energy towards sustainability, often against strong vested interests.
That's the core challenge of global environmental governance. It's a constant tightrope walk, addressing the immediate economic needs and aspirations of people today while fulfilling these crucial long-term commitments to protect the planet for the future.
Understanding the text of these conventions is the first step, as you said, but understanding the politics, the economics, and the sheer difficulty of implementation, that's the deeper understanding needed.
Precisely. It requires seeing the connections, the conflicts, and the complex efforts being made to make these global goals a reality on the ground.
Well, this has been an incredibly thorough exploration. Thank you for guiding us through this complex web.
My pleasure. Keep digging into these agreements, look for how they connect, and maybe even investigate how effectively they're being implemented in your own area.
Great advice. Thanks again for joining us on the deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Telegram and Instagram. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.